talk about the sacrifices so far. So tell me about the sacrifice in chapter 1, the burnt offering. What do you remember about that?
That was a foundational one,
Yes?
and it was totally burnt up, or totally used.
Yes, yeah, completely consumed. Yep. What was it
It's a
for?
male without blemish.
Yes, that's going to be important today. Male without blemish. Why does that matter?
Males. Males are more valuable than females.
Male cattle.
Male
Yes,
cattle.
male sheep, that's right. So you're bringing, for the burnt offering, you're bringing the most valuable animal. Now, I think I said this, but I'll just clarify. The law doesn't say you have to bring the most valuable animal that you own, right? If you can own a bull and 5 rams, and you have the choice of bringing a ram instead of a bull. God doesn't say whatever the most expensive thing is that you have to bring it. But you remember that offering had different options for people to bring a different sacrifice based on what you could afford. And so, as a worshiper, you have the option of taking a less expensive sacrifice. Yeah. And why does it matter that it's without defect? The burnt offering. Atonement, yeah. And it's a broad, sort of the whole broad range of everything that's represented in atonement. So we talked a little bit about how inside atonement you have the concepts of ransom and purification. You can break those down into even smaller categories, but the burnt offering represents sort of all of that, as well as just the person who brings the sacrifice, the worshiper, just essentially handing everything over. There's a whole lot of symbolism in the burnt offering that makes it an appropriate sacrifice for all kinds of different occasions of worship. Okay, what about the grain offering? What do you remember about the grain offering?
There were different types that you could drink,
Yes. And what made the difference?
if they were cooked or baked or
Right.
fried in oil.
That's right. So you can bring it just raw. You can bring just raw flour together with the oil and incense, or you can cook it, and there's multiple ways that you can cook it. So all of those things are an option for when you bring a grain offering. What are you supposed to not include and definitely include?
Oil and then no yeast, no leaven, no leaven.
Right, so you can't bring yeast, you can't add yeast or sugar to it.
But it included oil, right?
So it did include oil, and something else was the salt.
Salt.
Right.
You weren't allowed to bring honey with it.
Right, because the yeast and the honey, or the sugar,
Cause fermentation.
that's right, which causes it to go bad faster. And because this is, it's in a context where it's emphasizing the covenant relationship between the Lord and his people. There's nothing in this sacrifice that should in any way be corrupted or cause decay or rot. You add salt to it because salt is about preservation and permanence. And that symbolism is important in the sacrifice. And that's, the grain offering symbolizes tribute. That you're coming and bringing your tribute to the covenant king. There's a remembrance portion that gets burned, so it's an offering that's particularly appropriate if you're coming with praise to the Lord for having remembered you, or if you're coming with a particular prayer request, asking God to remember you. But it's this idea of bringing tribute to the covenant king. And it's important that the tribute comes after atonement, not before it, because tribute doesn't get you atonement, right? Tribute comes as a response to atonement. I see that hand.
Juanita
Yeah.
mentioned something else that
The incense.
Yeah, the incense and the oil, which the incense, of course, makes the burnt, or the grain offering more expensive. And that is suitable when you think about that imagery of it being tribute to the king. Yeah. Okay, anything else you want to add from the last couple of weeks? Okay, so let's keep going. We're going to look at the next offering in chapter 3. So chapter 3, verse 1. If someone's offering is a fellowship offering, and he offers an animal from the herd, whether male or female, he is to present before the Lord an animal without defect. He is to lay his hand on the head of his offering and slaughter it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood against the altar on all sides. From the fellowship offering he is to bring a sacrifice made to the Lord by fire, all the fat that covers the inner parts or is connected to them, both kidneys, with the fat on them near the loins, and the covering of the liver, which he will remove with the kidneys. Then Aaron's sons are to burn it on the altar on top of the burnt offering that is on the burning wood, as an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. If he offers an animal from the flock as a fellowship offering to the Lord, he is to offer a male or female without defect. If he offers a lamb, he is to present it before the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of his offering and slaughter it in front of the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's son shall sprinkle its blood against the altar on all sides. From the fellowship offering he is to bring a sacrifice made to the Lord by fire. Its fat, the entire fat tail cut off close to the backbone, all the fat that covers the inner parts or is connected to them, both kidneys with the fat on them near the loins, and the covering of the liver, which he will remove with the kidneys. The priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made to the Lord by fire. If his offering is a goat, he is to present it before the Lord. He is to lay his hand on its head and slaughter it in front of the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's son shall sprinkle its blood against the altar on all sides. From what he offers, he is to make this offering to the Lord by fire. All the fat that covers the inner parts or is connected to them, both kidneys with the fat on them near the loins, and the covering of the liver, which he will remove with the kidneys. The priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire, a pleasing aroma. All the fat is the Lord's. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come wherever you live. You must not eat any fat or any blood. Okay, so how does chapter 3 begin in verse 1?
With a type of offering,
Yes, and what is it?
mine says peace.
Right. A peace offering or a fellowship offering, depending on your translation. Now let's talk about that difference there. The word that's used for this offering is related to the root word for peace. And we talked in other studies about how that word peace in Hebrew, shalom, it's not simply the absence of conflict. That word is a state, it refers to a state of wholeness or completeness or well-being. And all of that is relevant in understanding the significance of this offering. So peace with God is not just about not being at odds with him, because you can be at peace with someone in that sense and not have much to do with them, right? You can be at peace with somebody because you live on the opposite end of the country. So it's not just about not being in conflict with him. Peace in Scripture is about experiencing the wholeness and the completeness and the well-being that results from being in right relationship with God. And so scripturally, peace and fellowship with God are inseparable. And there's a focus in this offering on the relationship that's represented by the ritual, and that relationship is possible because there's peace between God and the worshiper. So, yeah, it's a peace offering or a fellowship offering, and I think one of the reasons that some of the translations use fellowship here is to convey that there's a relational idea of more than just an absence of conflict, but of being in right relationship with each other. Okay, now let's look at the details. Again, just keep in mind this whole ceremony is intended to be a visual, acted out drama. So all the rituals in it are symbolic. I was thinking about this morning, that when if you're in a culture where most people don't read and you want to convey theological truth to them, this is one of the ways that you do it, is you do something that is vivid, something that people can see, they can hear, they can smell. In this case, they're going to be able to taste it, because if they walk away from this, they're going to have a profound remembrance of what they just witnessed and what they just experienced themselves. And so in all of this, God is communicating theological truths to the people. Now, I know there's a lot of repetition and sometimes it gets a little tedious, but the more familiar you become with the various parts of the offering, the more quickly you'll notice things that change. And when something changes in the ritual, that's the point that you want to pay attention to, because that something in it is changing in the symbolism. So we'll talk about some of those changes as we go. Okay, so first off, the peace offering or the fellowship offering can be cattle, sheep, or goats. If the offering's from the herd, well, do you notice a difference right here already?
Female.
It can be a female. Now, why would that be? Because there's already a hint that this offering is not on the same level as the burnt offering. It's important, but it's not fundamental the way the burnt offering is. So there's an option for bringing a less valuable animal as the sacrifice. And at the same time, it has to be without defect still, because of the symbolism that's represented by having an animal without defect. So, you know, in one sense, you bring an animal without defect because it shows your honor to the Lord, that you're not just bringing, you know, whatever animals you want to get rid of. And also, we talked about before, that symbolism of the animal being blameless. Because of what's represented by these sacrifices, it's important that it not be an animal that has defect. Okay, now what are the instructions the Lord gives about the offering in verse 2?
Lay his hand on the head.
Yes. Do you remember why? Why they lay their hands on the head?
Represents the person bringing the sacrifice.
That's right. When you put your hand on the head of the animal, you're basically identifying yourself with it. You're saying, this animal's going to stand in for me. And so, so you put your hand on the head of the animal, and it might be at that point the worshiper states the reason why they're bringing their sacrifice. And then after identifying with the animal, then the worshiper slaughters it by cutting its throat. And then the priests collect the blood in a bowl or a basin and splash it against the sides of the altar. Okay, now so far this should sound pretty familiar because this is exactly how the burnt offering starts as well. But then when we get to verse 3, that's when things start to get interesting. So, what changes? What does it tell us about this offering in verses 3 to 5?
They don't skin it.
They do, that would be just assumed.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's abbreviated in the, it's not included in the instructions because it would be assumed that they do that, yeah.
There are specific instructions about the fat, the kidneys, and the liver
Right,
that we didn't see in the other
that's right,
sacrifices.
yes. So it's also assumed that when the animal skins, that it would be cut up, but then these particular organs, it's the kidneys, the liver, and then all the fat connected to them, the priest takes all of that and burns it on the altar as a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. If it's offered together with a burnt offering, which it often was, then the peace offering is supposed to be placed on top of it. Okay, now, why would the internal organs and the fat be given specifically as an offering to the Lord?
That's why we're here. Yeah, we're all wondering now.
All right. The reason is because those were the choicest bits of the animal. Now that might sound odd to us because in our culture, a lot of people don't eat organ meat and fat is considered unhealthy. But in cultures where eating meat is rare, the organs and the fat are considered the best parts because they're the most, the organ meats are the most they're the richest, they're the most nutrient and protein dense, and the fat is the most calorie dense, which makes it more filling. I actually had this experience with fat in East Africa because, you know, when people don't eat fat or they don't eat meat very often, giving you a portion of meat that has fat on it is a good thing. Like they're giving you a better part of the meat because it goes, I mean, it fills you up and it keeps you full longer. And it's really odd in our culture, but it's very common in cultures where you only eat meat every once in a while. These are the bits that people want because it fills you up and because it's nutrient dense. You might have read verses in the Old Testament that says the people will eat the fat of the land. You ever heard that? What does that mean? Well, it's a metaphorical way of saying they're going to eat the best, the richest, the choicest food that's available in the land. One of the Bible studies a couple weeks ago when we covered this, the woman told me the next day after we had studied this, she was watching a nature program about lions, and she said it had this program how when a mother lion would kill something, she would eat the internal organs and then take the flesh would go to the cubs. And she said, and I was watching that thinking she's eating the internal organs, and then they said, because that's the most nutritious part of the animal. And she's like, it's Leviticus. But this is why those parts are given to the Lord, because that's considered the best part of the animal. So in this sacrifice, the richest, choicest, best parts are always reserved for the covenant king. And by presenting the fat to the Lord, they're giving him not only the best they have, but they're acknowledging him to be the one worthy of praise. To give anything less to the king would be an insult. I mean, for us, it would be like taking the prime rib and giving it to somebody else. You're giving him the best of what's there.
Sally, and then the priests will keep that. That will become theirs.
That gets burned up.
Oh, okay.
They get a share of the meat,
Okay, but not.
which we'll come back to in a minute.
Okay.
But no, the organs and the fat
Are burned.
are burned up because that's the Lord's portion. One of the commentators I read made another point that I thought was also interesting. So when we talk about the seat of your emotions, you know, where it is that you feel things, we talk about it being your heart, right? It's your heart that feels sad or your heart that feels happy or whatever. For the Israelites, the kidneys or the entrails in the Old Testament are the seat of the emotions. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about, is if you were to take the heart out of the animal and put it on the altar, as an English speaker, you might see some symbolism to the fact that it's the heart, right? Because it's almost like taking the innermost part of who you are. If you've just identified yourself with this animal, and then you take its heart and you put it on the altar, well, you could already see a sort of connection to that, can't you? Like putting something of yourself. Well, I think there's some of that in this ritual as well, because for them, it would be the kidneys or the liver, the entrails, that would be the seat of their emotions. So they're doing what's comparable for them in Hebrew. They're taking the bit that would be the innermost part of who you are, they're taking that bit and putting it on the altar. It's an interesting sort of graphic picture of handing the deepest part of who you are just over and putting it on the altar.
Sally, even back in English times, even during Shakespeare's time and before, they talked about the root of your emotions was your stomach. You get that saying that he doesn't have the stomach to do something. He should fire someone or something, but he doesn't have the stomach for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I heard a language once where they talked about, the seat of your emotions is your liver. So you would say, you know, I love you with all my liver. Instead of saying I love you with all my heart. But if the seat of your emotions is your kidneys and your liver, then it would make sense that you take that part and put it on the altar.
So what did they do with the heart?
Okay, now, there's for cattle. What about in verses 6 to 11? Then what does he say?
Juanita and I were talking, what's the question?
Quiet in the back. Instructions in 6 to 11. What are the instructions he gives them in 6 to 11?
For a lamb instead.
Right. And just as a side note, I think all the translations say lamb, but the Hebrew word actually isn't age specific, so it could be an adult sheep as well, any kind of sheep. But these instructions are for sheep instead of cattle. There's one major difference in here. Did you catch it?
Male or female?
So it can be male or female, like the cattle. Anything else?
The tail is mentioned.
The tail gets a big mention right here. Now, why would that be? Because the type of sheep that's referred to right here is a broad-tailed sheep.
Broad-tailed?
Broad-tailed sheep. And unlike other sheep that have a short tail, this one it has a tail that's long and broad, just like what it says. The reason that matters is because the broad tail of this sheep contains a mass of fat that can weigh up to 28 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
So now you understand why there are specific instructions about the tail, right? Because if there's that much fat contained in the tail, who gets it? God does. So they have to make sure that they take all of that fat from the tail and include it in the offering that's burned up on the altar.
That's Remy's size, she's 27 pounds, so
Yeah, that would have to be a pretty big sheep.
big
Yeah.
tail.
But I read this thing that said it's considered a delicacy in many parts of the world today. I'd never even heard of broad-tailed sheep, but it turns out lots of people eat them, I guess. So the entire fat tail is supposed to be burned along with the rest of the fat.
Cracklings.
Cracklings, there you go. And in all the other details, the offering is basically the same. What about 12 to 16?
Goat.
Yes. And even though the instructions are abbreviated, the most important things get repeated. That is, presenting it before the Lord, pressing a hand on its head, slaughtering it, splashing the blood on the altar, offering the fat and the internal organs to the Lord as a food offering, an aroma that's pleasing to the Lord. That's the stuff that's most significant. And we'll see as we continue through sacrifices, through Leviticus, it appears to me that goats and sheep are essentially interchangeable. There just doesn't seem to be much difference. Here, there's a difference because of the fat, on the tail of a sheep. But it seems like you can use a goat or a sheep, and it really doesn't matter. They're pretty well interchangeable. Okay.
So on 12,
Yes.
sorry, can they use a male or a female? It doesn't
Yes.
specify that, okay.
Now, did you notice that right here, he adds something where he says at the end of 16, did you notice what he added at the end of 16?
It's
All-
a perpetual statute that they don't eat fat or blood.
That's right. So in 16, he says all the fat is the Lord's, all of it. Not just the fat around the organs, it's actually all the fat that belongs to the Lord. And then on that note, the last instruction in verse 17 is, for all the generations to come, you don't eat any fat, and you don't eat any blood. Now, the instructions in this chapter don't specify this, but we'll get to it when we get to chapter 7. What do you do with the rest of the animal? Okay, so that still leaves a whole lot of the animal left. And what we'll see in chapter 7 is the rest of the animal gets parceled out between the priest and the worshipers. So there's a particular portion that goes to the priest who offers the sacrifice. There's another portion that goes to the priests in general, and all the rest of the meat, the worshiper eats. And there are some specific rules about that. You can't take it home with you. When you offer it as a sacrifice, it's like you give the animal to the Lord, and he takes his portion, and he gives back to you this portion of the meat, and you sit down in a ceremonially clean place, and you have lunch, and you eat what's left. Okay, now think about how much there would be if you bring a calf. How much meat are you going to have?
On a calf and.
Or a lamb, or a full, yeah.
A lot.
Even with a calf, you're going to have a lot of meat, right? You're not going to be able to, probably, to sit down and eat this offering by yourself. So typically what people did is they didn't come alone. When you bring a fellowship offering, you bring people with you. You bring your friends with you, you bring your family with you. You would bring a fellowship offering, and this isn't something you do every other week unless you're somebody who has a lot of money. For a lot of people, they might only bring this kind of offering once a year. And so it would be a big deal to come with your family, and you would invite other people to sit down and have fellowship with you. So it's not just fellowship between you and the Lord, it's fellowship between you, the Lord, and everybody you bring with you, so you sit down and have a meal together. And it's not just the meat, we'll see again when we get to chapter 7, that when you have this meal, you bring with it a bunch of bread to accompany it. So there's a full meal that you get together with everyone who comes, and you sit down and have a meal right there, after you finish the sacrifice. Okay, now, let's talk about that last bit in verse 17. Why is it such a big deal that nobody eats the fat or the blood? Well, as we saw already with the fat, it's considered the best portion of the meat, so it belongs exclusively to the Lord. And for anyone else to eat it is kind of like going to a banquet and then taking for yourself the portion that's reserved for the king. It's very arrogant, and it's hugely dishonoring to the Lord. So the people are forbidden from eating it. Now, just as a side note, knowing that the rest of the meat gets parceled out first with the priests and then with the people, so they can have this meal. We're actually going to stop and read a little bit from 1 Samuel chapter 2. So you can follow along or just listen if you like. But we're going to read in 1 Samuel 2, starting in verse 12. So just by way of context, this is during the time of the judges. And you know what it was like during the time of the judges. There was no king, and everybody did whatever they wanted. And turns out the priests weren't much better. And so this the context for this is the tabernacle. So they haven't built the temple yet, but they have the tabernacle established. People are going to worship there, but things are a little crazy during the time of the judges. Now, the guy who's mentioned first, Eli, he is the high priest at the time when all of this happens. So, 1 Samuel 2:12. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now, it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the man said to him, "Let the fat be burned up first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would then answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. Okay, do you see the weight now of what they're doing when they come and take for themselves whatever portion of the sacrifice they want, including the portions that were supposed to be exclusively for the Lord? So these priests, who are supposed to be mediating between the Lord and the people, are coming and basically they're desecrating the sacrifices. They're taking the portion that belongs to the Lord. They're taking whatever portion they want from the worshiper. How do you think God's going to respond to this?
Oh.
Yeah, the sparks are going to fly, right? Because there's no way the Lord is going to let the priests dishonor him like that, taking his portion of the sacrifices and not do something. Okay, so turn over to verse 27. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, in your family line there will never be an old man. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared, only to blind your eyes with tears and to grieve your heart, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be assigned to you. They will both die on the same day. How seriously does the Lord take this? The dishonor to him by what the priests are doing, it's something so serious that he not only cuts them out, the whole family, he cuts them out of the priesthood. He executes the priests. like it's that big of a deal that they are being so arrogant as to take what rightly belongs to the Lord. And so they're dishonoring the Lord first, but also the people who are bringing the sacrifices, because the choice parts don't belong to them. And you heard it even how the Lord said it. You're fattening yourself off of those parts, and those are the parts that are supposed to be. It's symbolic of life, it belongs to the Lord. And because it's symbolic of life, it's used to communicate the truths about the cost of atonement. And because the Lord uses it to teach people about atonement, he is very, very particular about how it's used. He absolutely forbids its misuse. And it's hugely important that the Israelites are never casual or flippant about blood. And we're going to see more about that when we get to chapter 17, but just knowing that emphasis on the use of blood, it's really important for understanding all the prohibitions about blood that come all throughout Leviticus. And the thing is, if you know what's coming in the New Testament, you know why the Lord would be so adamant that the Israelites take blood and its symbolism very seriously, because of what he's communicating through it, because of what's being foreshadowed by it. And so they don't drink it and they don't eat meat that hasn't had the blood drained out of it. Okay, now what sorts of things are emphasized in these instructions? We've talked about this a bit already, but how's the offering similar to the burnt offering and how's it different?
burnt offering was consumed, but the peace offering was eaten.
That's right, because there's this representation of fellowship. And you see, again, what's emphasized is presenting an animal without defect before the Lord, putting your hand on its head, slaughtering it, splashing the blood on the altar, offering the fat and the internal organs to the Lord as a food offering. There's some similarities that I think are important. You get an echo of the burnt offering in the peace offering. The way that it starts off, you get reminded of atonement. The purpose of this offering is not for atonement. It's for peace and fellowship. But you get something of the burnt offering inside it, I think, because there's always a reminder there is no fellowship without atonement. Like, you have to have atonement for you to be at peace with God. And his people have to always be mindful that access to him is costly for him. Like, our access to him is costly for him. And that reminder comes back in this sacrifice, and it'll come back in the one next week too with the purification offering. And it's clear from the ritual that this offering is important, but again, it's not as fundamental as the burnt offering, which makes sense because atonement is the foundation for everything else.
So Sally, is the assumption that these same people that are now bringing grain and fellowship have already first brought in sacrifice for atonement before they can bring the next sacrifices?
Typically, that's how it would work, yes. In fact, it would typically go purification offering, which we'll get to next week. It would typically go purification offering, burnt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering.
Are they all on top of each other?
You put the burnt offering, you put this on top of that, so the purification offering would go first, but if you bring a fellowship offering, he mentions put it on top of the burnt offering. Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about the purpose of this offering, which we kind of have already. But there are various occasions when a peace offering or a fellowship offering is appropriate. We'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 7. But the purpose of the offering is for the Lord and the worshiper to share a covenant meal together. It's a picture of peace and fellowship. The whole animal's the Lord's, but he takes his portion, and then he gives the sacrifice back to the worshiper to sit down and enjoy with him. It's his provision that makes both atonement and fellowship possible. I wonder if you noticed a progression in the offerings based on who can eat it. So the first offering, holy, is the Lord's. Nobody eats it. The second one is shared between the Lord and the priests. The third one is shared between the Lord, the priests, and the worshiper. Why? Because there's a theological progression from atonement to tribute to communion. And both the sacrifices and the priests are necessary for that progression to happen. And why would that be? Well, because the sacrifices and the priests all point to Jesus. Now, as a side note, did you notice that there aren't any birds mentioned as an option for a peace offering, which there were for the burnt offering? The reason for that is because a bird is small enough that after all the bits are taken out for the Lord and for the priest, there's not much left to eat. It's too small. That's why the birds aren't included. Now, of course, that might mean that there are a lot of people who would never have the opportunity to present a fellowship offering, because if you can't afford it, you're sort of out. Does that mean that poor people could never participate in this kind of meal? No, because again, the meal was intended to include friends and extended family members. So, you know, if you take a fairly large animal, how many people are you going to invite to go with you? And typically, I mean, it would be like at Thanksgiving or at Christmas. If you know somebody who doesn't have a place to go at Thanksgiving or Christmas, or somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, or somebody who doesn't have family around, you invite them to go with you, right? To come to your house and eat. I think there's that kind of idea even here, is that if you take this large animal as a fellowship offering, you're going to take people with you. And maybe people who typically wouldn't be able to go and offer a fellowship offering. But a person of means, your family, you would have the opportunity to participate in it with them. And then, of course, anytime there's a big national celebration, something that includes like a whole nation, well, you see this at the dedication of the temple. Solomon brings the fellowship offerings, and there's thousands of animals. Why would he do that? Because he's providing the food for everybody who's there to be able to participate in the covenant meal that they sit down to together. Okay, now, back to that progression of the sacrifices. Don't miss the weight of the picture of what's being communicated right here in the peace offering, of the worshiper sitting down at the dwelling place of God and eating a meal with him. That's the ultimate goal of atonement. The goal of atonement is not just that you get forgiven and you walk away. The goal of atonement is communion with God. But you might have caught the fact that despite having a covenant meal with the Lord, the worshiper still can't go into the tabernacle, right? You're still not allowed to just walk into the direct presence of the Lord. That's because this meal is a physical illustration that points to something else. The ultimate goal of our salvation is that in Christ, the final sacrifice, we would be able to sit down directly in the presence of the Lord and have a covenant meal with him. That's what's being foreshadowed in all of these sacrifices. Let me read a quote for you. Upon ascending into the heavenly abode of God, which is what's symbolized by the burnt offering, the Israelite then enjoys the hospitality of the house of God. That aspect of the worship is highlighted by the communion ritual of the peace offering or the fellowship offering, where the Israelite was given a portion of the sacrificial meat to eat with his family and friends in the presence of God. In the ancient Near East, as is still the case in a lot of cultures today, friendships were solidified and covenants were sealed by a shared meal, and hospitality itself was a very serious matter of honor. In the Bible, God himself is seen to be the model of what it means to be the ultimate host. When brought into the Lord's house through the way that he has opened, the worshiper is treated as a son. Because you don't just come in and then go out again, you come in, sit down at the table, and you have a meal. And you do that at the Lord's house. And that imagery is really important, that God doesn't just want people to come and get forgiven. He wants people to come and fellowship, to sit down and fellowship with him. Now, the fact that someone may enter the presence of the consuming fire at all without immediate condemnation and destruction is in itself a miracle. But to do so not merely to render tribute, which is fitting enough, but also to enjoy table fellowship with the Lord, that is the marvel of Israel's covenant, that God created humanity for the sake of fellowship and communion with him. Okay, now, when you think about that, is there anything that then you think about in the New Testament that connects to this? Like what? Communion. That's right. The peace offering, the fellowship offering, is what stands in the background of the Lord's Supper. So at the Last Supper, when Jesus, he gives the disciples the blood. Well, what does he say, or the wine? What does he say about it? It's his blood. It's the blood of the new covenant, and it's his. And then what does he tell them to do with it? Drink it. Wait, what? You know what we just saw in Leviticus about the blood? Nobody drinks it. Until you get to the Lord's Supper, and then Jesus says, here's the symbol of my blood, now drink it. Why? Why would he tell you to drink it?
He's completed the sacrifices, right?
And what's the imagery? If the blood is symbolic of life, what's the imagery of drinking it?
Giving us eternal life.
Yeah, and you're taking it into yourself, right? You're not just dabbing it on yourself, you're actually ingesting it. You're taking into yourself the life that is represented by what it is that Christ has done for you on the cross. It's significant that they get to this picture of a meal, of a fellowship meal with Jesus, and he says, okay, drink it, drink the blood, eat the flesh, which is him. Now, you can't understand that until you're on the other side of the cross. I have no idea what the disciples were thinking when they heard all of that. But for a Jew who knows this background about the blood, to have somebody say, okay, here's the symbol of my blood, now drink it. I would guess that the disciples were like, wait, what? Like, what's going on right here? And that's the point. The point of all these blood prohibitions in Leviticus is so that when the day comes that the Messiah says, here's my blood poured out for you, drink it, the Jews would stop and say, who's this guy? Who is he that he would say that? He's the source of life. And you don't get that life just from drinking something. You get it because you put faith in what he's done through the gospel. which again is why, how can you get it until you're on the other side of the cross? But it's significant that he says, drink it, because there is this imagery of taking into the deepest part of who you are, the life of Jesus, that then cleanses you from the inside out. It gives you new life from the inside out. So, the Last Supper was more like a peace offering than a burnt offering, in that they're both meals. Christ's death on the cross is a closer parallel to the burnt offering, but his sharing of his body and blood with his disciples is the parallel to the peace offering. So, I mean, just think about that, the next time you take communion. That imagery of that whole sacrifice, that you put your hand on his head, that it's his blood that gets poured out, but it doesn't stop there. Then you're invited to sit down with the Lord and to actually have a meal with him. But the meal starts with Christ. The first meal is Christ, right? That's the picture of what you're eating and drinking, and yet you have communion with God because of the sacrifice of Christ that he stands in on your behalf. He accomplishes your atonement, and he's also the means of communion. He's the means of fellowship with God. Now, is someone going to say something?
Well, I keep thinking we've just finished the letter to the church, and that explains the confusion and the pushback because it's contrary to everything, which Christ is contrary to everything, but Paul's letters are trying to change everybody's thinking.
Yeah. Read another quote for you. The Lord's Supper should be, like the peace offering, both a solemn and a joyful occasion. Solemn because no human being can lightheartedly enter God's presence and pledge to keep his laws. Joyful because God's grace and his promise exceed all that we can ask or think in this life and in the next. So there's a very sobering reality that's presented in the Lord's Supper when you know the background of the sacrifice. And you know the price that Jesus paid for us to have communion, but it doesn't stop with the sacrifice. It ends with fellowship with God, and that's really important. And also, all throughout Scripture, this picture of a communal meal comes back in spades. You read the prophecies about the new heavens and the new earth, because the prophets talk about a future feast that's coming when the people of God are going to ascend his mountain, and they're going to make their home and his dwelling place, and they're going to take a seat at his table. Well, there's a feast coming in Revelation. Do you remember what it's called?
The marriage supper of the Lamb.
The marriage supper of the Lamb. That's very interesting. So it's a peace offering meal. It's a fellowship meal. It's a covenant meal, but the covenant imagery is not of a treaty. The covenant imagery is of a wedding, right? Why is it the marriage supper of the Lamb instead of just the
Because
marriage supper?
We are the bride of Christ, the Lamb.
And why is it called the Lamb right there
Because
instead of
that's
the
the
bride?
sacrifice.
Because of the sacrifice. It could have been, the marriage supper of the divine bridegroom, which would be right, but it's the
Sounds
marriage
like something
supper.
out of, what's that movie, Princess Bride?
Oh, yeah. But it's the marriage supper of the Lamb because the bridegroom becomes the sacrifice. He becomes the sacrifice to purify the bride so that she can sit down at the table. The reason we get to sit there at the marriage supper is because of what Jesus does to give us a place at the table. That's what we're looking forward to. It's the atonement by the Lamb that has made sure for us the fellowship, not only that we have now with God, but that's coming in the future. Okay. Comments? Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think it's beautiful that they get to sit and eat, because I guess I always pictured before them bringing this valuable stuff and just burning it all up and being hungry. And I didn't realize that some of the offerings, they could sit down and eat as a meal, so that's interesting.
Was the meat like Passover in the peace offering? If they didn't eat it all, did they have to burn it up?
Yes. So, in chapter 7, it gives some specific instructions for how long you have to eat the meat before it's considered then unclean and you have to burn it. Yeah. so there's a limited amount of time you have to eat it, and you can't take it home with you. You have to eat it there because it's holy.
Does the priest eat with you?
I don't know. The law
And does
doesn't
he
say
grill it?
Yeah. You do wonder, like, do they have barbecue options?
I was wondering, when it says that you shall perpetually not eat the fat or blood, does that mean just in the sacrifice or at home when you're cooking? Is that a law that the Jews had?
Yes, so we'll get to this a bit later in Leviticus 2. That sounds like chapter 2, Leviticus later. The laws are not just for when you bring a sacrifice. So there's something specific it says later where if you have a sheep or a bull or something that gets killed by a wild animal, so now you can't give it as a sacrifice, but that's a lot of meat that you wouldn't want to go to waste. You can eat it, but you can't eat the fat. You can do other things with the fat because you're not bringing it as a sacrifice, so you're not burning it on the Lord's altar. But you still can't eat it. So you can make candles out of it, or you can use it for soap, or I don't know what you do with it. Use it for I don't know. There's all kinds of things you could do with the fat of the animal. You just can't eat it because it belongs to the Lord.
And how come in the peace offering, they only want part of the liver, not the whole liver?
I don't know.
That was interesting.
And
They
some
want the long bone.
And some of the commentators were like, they think it actually it means the whole thing, and some of them think it's just part of it, and I don't know why it's only part.
When they use the word lobe, to me, that sounds like the whole thing, because
That's the long
because of
bone.
the shape of it, of the liver. Isn't the liver kind of shaped?
I don't know, I didn't pay enough attention in it. Okay, and last things, you're just itching. Okay, I'll stop there. All right,